Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Pierce said when Laura Bennett arrived at St. Michael's 8 months ago, his voice cutting across the crowded nurses' station like scalpel through silk. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She simply turned and walked toward Trauma Bay 3, where a patient was hemorrhaging into his abdomen and nobody else had moved yet. By the time she finished assisting the surgical team, 2 units of O-negative blood pushed through a 14-gauge angiocath, vitals stabilized, bleed contained. Pierce was already gone. He'd gone back to his office and begun digging through the hospital's billing records with the methodical precision of someone hunting for a specific prey. He found the irregularities within 3 days. 5 surgical cases where supply costs were double the standard rate. Orthopedic hardware marked up 180%. Implant fees that bore no relation to any vendor's price list. He'd assumed it was administrative error until he ran the names. All 5 cases were his own patients. All 5 surgeries had been assisted by the new hire. The same nurse who'd known exactly which medications were wrong before the resident even noticed. The same nurse who moved through his operating room like she'd done this exact thing 1,000 times before in a place where mistakes meant body bags. He began watching her in earnest after that. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical drone as Laura moved through the night shift at St. Michael's, the antiseptic smell burning the back of her nose the way it always did, that sharp chemical bite that never quite felt like healing. Cold tile under her shoes. The ventilator in room 407 wheezed its rhythmic mechanical pulse. She worked without the hesitation that marked most new nurses, her movements economical and precise. 90 seconds per patient assessment. Medication administration on exact schedule. For placement on the first stick, every time. Her hands moved like they'd been trained by something more than nursing school textbooks. The other nurses noticed. Sarah from Pediatrics watched her perform a catheter change in room 304 and made a note to ask where she'd trained. Marcus, one of the day shift techs, mentioned to his girlfriend that the quiet one from night shift was like watching a surgeon work in a corridor. Nobody said it out loud, but they all felt it. Laura Bennett was overqualified for this job, and nobody knew why she was here. Inside her scrubs jacket, carefully sewn into the lining near her left shoulder blade where it wouldn't show even if someone was looking, was a faded unit patch. The colors had bled into each other over time, the gold emblem barely visible now. Valkyrie Squadron. Baghdad deployment, 2009 to 2011, then again in 2013 to 2015. 2 tours that had shaped her into something that wasn't quite a nurse but looked exactly like one if you didn't examine too closely. She'd trained for 12 years as a trauma surgeon's assistant in a combat support hospital, which meant she could do things that nurses weren't supposed to do, see things before monitors announced them, move faster than the textbooks said was possible. Captain Laura Bennett, call sign Valkyrie, had learned to triage patients in 115-degree heat with mortars landing close enough to rattle windows. Pressure wounds, sucking chest injuries, hemorrhage control, airway management under fire. The nursing license came later, after she'd rotated out of active duty and into a civilian world that felt like moving underwater. She'd been placed at St. Michael's by her handler exactly 8 months ago, ostensibly as a new RN, actually to monitor a suspected foreign intelligence asset recovering from surgery on the 4th floor. Routine assignment. Low-risk observation. In and out in 6 months. Except Dr. Pierce had decided to become a problem within the first week. She checked on her assigned patients in sequence. Room 302, Mrs. Chen, post-op hip replacement, pain control stable, drain output within parameters, vital steady. Room 405, Mr. Hernandez, diabetic foot ulcer debridement, wound care scheduled for 0400 hours, antibiotic infusion running on time. The cardiac monitors beeped their steady rhythm like a metronome counting down some invisible clock. She worked without speaking, without making eye contact with the other nurses, without drawing any attention beyond her technical competence. Invisible. That was the job. That was always the job. Blend in, observe, don't deviate. Don't let anyone see the woman underneath the scrubs, the one with scars on places that shouldn't scar, hands that knew how to apply direct pressure to a severed carotid artery, lungs that had learned to breathe through smoke and mortar dust. but staff sergeants from your former unit tend to complicate invisible. Room for 12 contained Marcus Cole, Special Forces medic, transferred from Fort Campbell 3 days ago with IED blast injuries sustained during a training accident that nobody was discussing in detail. 3 broken ribs. Punctured left lung. Bilateral contusions. Admitted with acute respiratory distress, then stabilized enough for transfer to a regular floor instead of ICU. He was sleeping when Laura entered, his chest rising in the careful shallow patterns of someone whose body had learned that deep breaths meant pain. She moved to his bedside and checked the monitors without disturbing him. Oxygen saturation 92%. Heart rate 87. Blood pressure stable. The monitors glowed soft and steady. She'd been briefed before her assignment, shown his file, told he was the target's roommate in the cardiac ward upstairs and therefore relevant to observation protocols. But she hadn't known, or maybe she'd known and the handler hadn't mentioned it, or maybe the handler had tested her by not mentioning it, that Marcus Cole was the same medic who'd taken over her combat support team after she'd rotated out of Baghdad in 2011. He'd kept her unit alive for another 8 months. He'd written her a letter after she'd left that said, "Captain, you set the standard too high. Nobody else is going to meet it, but we'll all try." She'd kept that letter somewhere, buried deep enough that no part of her civilian cover could accidentally find it. The needle decompression she would perform on him, that would come later. The crisis that would force her hands into motion and strip away the careful construction of the nursing student. Not yet. Not tonight. Tonight was observation. Tonight was the invisible shift, the careful maintenance of a cover that was already starting to crack at the edges because the universe had a sense of timing that made no sense at all. Dr. Pierce appeared for his 200 rounds with that particular energy he carried when he'd been thinking about something for hours. She felt him before she saw him, that shift in atmospheric pressure that good soldiers learn to recognize. Predator in the corridor. She was checking Coles for placement, saline running at 50 milliliters per hour, line patent, no infiltration, when Pierce stopped at the threshold of the room and watched her work. She didn't acknowledge him. She finished her assessment, noted the time on the chart, and stepped back from the bed with the kind of calm that came from having already survived worse situations than a doctor's scrutiny. "Seems thorough," Pierce said. His voice had that quality of manufactured friendliness that masked something colder underneath. He stepped into the room without waiting for acknowledgement. "How long have you been nursing, Miss Bennett?" She'd prepared for this. 8 months of preparation, actually. The file she'd been given said she'd worked in a small private clinic in Portland for 3 years before relocating for personal reasons. References that would check out. Background that would hold up to cursory examination. "Several years," she answered, keeping her voice in that register that meant no threat, no challenge, no presence. "My previous role was clinic-based." "Clinical background is excellent," Pierce said, moving to Cole's bedside chart. He read through her entries with the careful attention of someone looking for errors. There wouldn't be any. Her charting was textbook perfect. Every abbreviation correct, every assessment within scope, every notation professional. "Your medication calculations?" Double-checked twice. "Hospital protocol?" He nodded slowly, then turned to look at her directly. His eyes had that calculation in them, the look of someone beginning to build a narrative. "The patient in 407. Mrs. Yamamoto. You suggested to Dr. Hassan that her pain medication protocol wasn't optimal. She was receiving inadequate pain control," Laura said. "Standard dosing wasn't addressing her symptoms." Hassan appreciated the observation. Hassan appreciated it, Pierce repeated. He was still watching her, and she could feel the weight of his attention like something physical, something that pressed against her composure the way pressure affected arterial bleeding. "You understand that suggesting medication changes is outside your scope as a nurse." I made an observation to the attending. He chose whether to implement it. "Right." Pierce handed the chart back. "Well, continue monitoring Staff Sergeant Cole closely. Any changes, any deterioration in respiratory status, we need to know immediately." She nodded without speaking. Watched him leave. Waited until his footsteps had faded down the corridor before she allowed her hand to move to her jacket, to the small unit patch sewn so carefully into the lining that nobody would ever find it unless they were searching for something specific. Her fingers didn't tremble against the fabric. That part of her, the part that had learned fear in a combat support hospital and had learned to metabolize fear into function, that part had been trained too well to ever tremble. Sophie was asleep when Laura arrived home at 0630, her small form curled under the quilted blanket that her grandmother had made. Laura moved through the apartment on quiet feet, the kind of quiet that soldiers learn, the kind that means you're trained to move through spaces where noise gets people killed. She'd made it almost to the bedroom when Sophie stirred, that particular child sense that comes from knowing when a parent is home, and called out in the dark. "Mommy? Why are you home?" Her daughter's voice carried the disorientation of early morning, the confusion of a 7-year-old whose mother usually didn't return until full daylight. "Just early relief today, honey. Go back to sleep." Laura moved back to Sophie's bed and brushed hair away from her daughter's forehead. The touch was gentle, but even that required control, the awareness that her hands had been trained for violence, and gentle was something that had to be managed consciously. Sophie was asleep again within seconds, her breathing evening out into the deep rhythm of childhood. Laura sat on the edge of her daughter's bed for 5 minutes, just 5. She'd learned to compartmentalize time the way other people compartmentalized emotion, and let herself understand what she'd been sent to do and what she'd been sent to become. A civilian. A mother. A nurse. The woman who could explain to a 7-year-old why she sometimes came home with emotions that didn't fit the narrative of a 12-hour shift at a hospital. That's what she was supposed to be. That's what the paperwork said. That's what the handler would confirm if anyone in the right government office asked the right questions. But Marcus Cole was in room 412, and he was her former medic, and in exactly 9 days his breathing would become laboured in a way that monitors might miss if someone wasn't watching closely enough. And Dr. Pierce was building something in the silence between his glances and his careful questions, building a theory about the new nurse that didn't quite fit with the documentation, building a narrative that would eventually force the kind of confrontation that didn't have room for covers or civilian status or the simple desire to keep her daughter's life intact. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she already knew, in that way that soldiers know things before they happen, that walking toward this instead of away from it was going to cost her everything she'd carefully constructed in the past 8 months. Walking toward Marcus Cole meant walking toward the Pentagon. It meant walking toward a reckoning that would either validate everything she'd been or destroy the careful fiction that kept her daughter safe. For now, there was only the darkness of her apartment and Sophie's sleeping breath and the faded unit patch sewn into her jacket lining, waiting in the dark for a moment when it would no longer need to stay hidden. The morning shift report came in at 6:19 a.m., the kind of clinical briefing that rolled past Laura like weather, vital signs, medication reconciliation, the usual litany of recovering bodies. She stood at the nurse's station with her coffee cooling in a ceramic mug, listening to Maria describe room 318's post-op status, when Dr. Pierce emerged from the hallway with the kind of entrance that made fluorescent light seem brighter. His white coat was pressed into sharp creases. His face carried the expression of someone about to perform. Room 318 held James Kaplan, 63, recovering from a pancreatic resection. Laura was already inside when Pierce arrived with Kaplan's adult children, a daughter in business casual, a son checking his phone. She was performing wound care at the abdomen incision, her movements precise and deliberate, sterile field established, betadine swabbing concentric circles from the incision outward, the dressing secured with the exact tension that prevented fluid weeping without cutting off circulation. Textbook technique. Protocol perfect. She'd done this same procedure 18 times in the last 4 days. Pierce stopped in the doorway. His voice, when it came, had the carrying quality of someone performing for an audience that included everyone within earshot. "Nurse Bennett. This is unacceptable." Laura's hand stilled. She did not look up immediately. She finished securing the final corner of the sterile dressing, then turned. Her eyes met his with the flat calm of someone who'd already calculated 3 exit routes. "Doctor. Something incorrect. That wound care protocol is completely improper." Did you even review the chart? His smile was the smile of a man who knew the audience was listening. Kaplan's daughter leaned forward. The son stopped scrolling. This is exactly the kind of sloppy attention to detail that creates complications. Laura straightened. One measured breath. She'd been in enough briefing rooms with generals to recognize theater when she saw it. Doctor, this is the exact protocol you ordered yesterday. Second intercostal space technique, sterile field, standard dressing change interval. Her voice remained level. The wound margins are clean. No exudate. No sign of infection. His jaw tightened. The son actually looked up from his phone. Are you contradicting me in front of this family? Pierce's voice dropped to that particular register that made disagreement sound like insubordination. Perhaps you need remedial training, nurse. Perhaps you're not qualified for this unit. The room went quiet in that specific way hospitals have when someone has just crossed from professional disagreement into something uglier. Kaplan's daughter stared at the floor. Her brother cleared his throat. Laura wiped her hands on a clean towel. Slow. Deliberate. She met Pierce's eyes and held them. Not in anger. In something colder than anger, the kind of steady gaze that doesn't require validation. I've been shot at by people more competent than you, Doctor. One tear escaped. Just one. She wiped it away calmly without breaking eye contact, then turned back to her supply cart and began restocking. Pierce's face went the color of old concrete. He left the room without another word. The daughter made a small, confused sound. Laura continued her work, hand steady as surgical steel, and behind her she could hear Pierce's footsteps accelerating down the hallway like someone retreating from a fire. But that wasn't the worst part. 2 days later, Laura sat alone in the break room with her lunch, turkey sandwich, apple, the protein bar she'd learned to like in Baghdad. The room hummed with the particular silence of an empty space. She'd come at 1:16 p.m. specifically to avoid the noon crush, a calculated attempt to eat 30 minutes of her shift in peace. She lasted 18 minutes before the paging system crackled to life. All available nursing staff to the nurses' station. Critical update. Repeat, all available nursing staff to the nurses' station for critical updates. Pierce's voice, clinical and precise. Laura watched through the break room doorway as the hallway filled with movement. Nurses appeared from patient rooms, from medication stations, from supply closets. Within 90 seconds, the corridor outside the station had become a crowded convergence of scrubs and concern. She stayed seated, took another bite of her sandwich, and waited. The critical update lasted for minutes. It was about parking validation. The hospital's agreement with the adjacent garage had changed, effective immediately. Residents needed to register their license plates by Friday. That was all. That was the emergency. The nurses filed back out, shaking their heads, exchanging the exhausted eye roll of people summoned for nothing. The break room remained empty. Laura finished her sandwich alone, watching the fluorescent panel above her flicker in that almost imperceptible way that meant the ballast was starting to fail. She'd been eating alone for 3 shifts now. Maria, who used to sit with her on Tuesdays, had developed a sudden allergy to the break room's coffee. The new grad who'd asked her questions had been reassigned. The experienced nurses who'd worked her shifts, Jennifer, Teresa, the older CNAs who knew everything, had all been rotated to different units or different hours. It was strategic. It was competent. It was the work of someone methodical and patient. The notice appeared on the unit bulletin board on Wednesday morning. Laura saw it when she arrived for her shift at 6:45 a.m. It was printed on official hospital letterhead, posted in the space where schedule changes and continuing education opportunities normally lived. Everyone saw it. Everyone read it. Disciplinary action notice. Employee, L. Bennett, RN. Violation, insubordination. Questioning physician orders without cause. Incident date, date. Supervisor, Dr. Marcus Pierce, Chief of Surgery. Status, formal written warning. Further violations may result in suspension or termination. Charge nurse Maria was at the station, reviewing patient assignments. She didn't look up when Laura walked past. The younger nurses who'd seemed friendly during orientation suddenly found reasons to be in different parts of the unit. Laura approached the bulletin board, unpinned the notice with movements that felt like they were happening to someone else, and folded it in half with the kind of precision that suggested she was still, somewhere very deep, a woman who had folded maps and photographs and handwritten orders into jacket pockets in a place where getting details wrong meant people died. She placed the notice in her locker, between her street clothes and her phone. Then she went to room 412 to assess Staff Sergeant Cole's post-op status. His breathing sounded clearer today. O2 sat 96%. Pain controlled. The kind of recovery trajectory that suggested things were finally moving in the right direction. Laura was checking the surgical drain output when her phone buzzed. An encrypted message from a number that didn't appear in her contact list. Mission parameters changed. Foreign asset no longer priority. Maintain cover. New brief 0300 hours. Do not acknowledge. She read it once. Deleted it. Returned to charting Cole's vitals as if nothing had arrived. As if nothing had shifted. But everything had shifted. She'd spent 8 months building a civilian identity, the hesitant nurse, the one who questioned herself, the one who didn't quite fit. She'd swallowed Pierce's contempt like medication because the foreign asset upstairs was the mission. The financial corruption, the kickbacks, the billing irregularities she'd documented, that was secondary. That was the cover story. Now the cover story was all that remained. Laura finished her charting at 2:15 p.m. She worked the rest of her shift with the same quiet efficiency she'd brought to every shift since her arrival in Atlanta. She answered call lights. She distributed medications. She smiled at patients and deflected questions from curious residents. She was the nurse everyone didn't quite notice, the one doing the work while others talked about doing the work. By midnight, when she punched out, nobody had spoken to her except to verify orders or confirm shift handoff. She walked through the parking garage to her car, a 6-year-old Honda Civic, deliberately anonymous, and sat in the driver's seat without turning the engine on. Through the windshield, she could see the lit emergency entrance 3 levels up, the red cross that meant help was available for everyone except people like her. People with sealed files and deployments that didn't exist. People with ranks that had no official record. People who'd learned long ago that the quietest way through the world was to accept other people's contempt and wait. At 3:44 a.m., her phone buzzed again. A text message from an unknown number, routed through encryption, park level Beetle blue sedan. Keys under driver's mat. Briefing documents in door panel. 48-hour window before Pierce's financial irregularities trigger federal audit. Your assessment. She looked up at the hospital, glowing against the Atlanta sky like a ship in dark water. Inside, somewhere on the 4th floor, Staff Sergeant Cole was sleeping with chest tubes still in place. Inside, somewhere in the executive offices, Dr. Pierce was planning his next move against a nurse he'd underestimated completely. Inside, everything was exactly as it appeared. Laura texted back, standing by. Then she started her car and drove into the darkness, the faded unit patch still sewn into her jacket lining, still waiting for the moment when it would no longer need to stay hidden. The night shift started at 11 p.m., same as always, and Laura Bennett's badge scanner rejected her access to the 3rd floor supply room. The red light blinked. Access denied. She tapped it again against the magnetic pad, muscle memory from 8 months of routine. Red light. The scanner wheezed and clicked. Access denied. Around her, the hallway hummed with the low electric frequency of a hospital after midnight, ventilators breathing for sleeping patients 2 floors up, the distant ding of an elevator, the soft squeak of a housekeeping cart somewhere down the corridor. Laura stood motionless in front of that scanner for exactly 15 seconds, reading what it meant. Dr. Pierce had been systematic about everything else. Why not this? Her access codes had been downgraded. Not revoked entirely, that would leave a paper trail too obvious for the hospital administrator to ignore, but restricted to patient care areas only. No supply room. No medication vault. No emergency protocols. Just the rooms where she nursed and the corridors connecting them, a digital cage that narrowed with every restriction Pierce had layered over the past 72 hours. She could feel the walls closing, the way you feel them when you're in a city you don't belong to and the language shifts and suddenly you understand nobody wants you here. Except Laura had walked out of cities nobody wanted her in before. She pulled her phone from her pocket. The handler's message from that morning still sat unanswered in encrypted text. Extraction window closes at 0600 hours. Advise. For hours. Maybe less. That was the calculation running underneath everything now: time, distance, variables. After Baghdad, after carrying Staff Sergeant Marcus Cole through 117-degree heat with 2 other wounded soldiers who were heavier than they should have been and the rotor wash from the medevac Black Hawk shaking the air like God was angry, time had become currency. You spent it wrong, people died. Simple arithmetic. Laura turned and walked back toward the 4th-floor patient rooms. The supply room could wait. What she needed was in room for 12, and that required thinking 3 moves ahead of Dr. Pierce's competence. He was good at this, the slow suffocation of authority, the strategic choking off of resources, the kind of professional sabotage that left no visible bruises. She'd seen Afghan intelligence officers do the same thing to American soldiers whose presence in their country they resented, make it impossible to function, wait for the breakdown, document the failure. Pierce wasn't trained by the CIA, but he understood the fundamentals. The night nurse call light above room for 12 had been off for the last 2 hours. Staff Sergeant Marcus Cole was sleeping, his chest rising and falling with the uneven rhythm of someone healing from 3 broken ribs and a blast concussion. Laura had checked him at 2,300 hours. All vitals stable. O2 saturation 94%. Heart rate stable. The kind of patient who made night shift tolerable, injured but not critical, resting, giving the nurses time to breathe. Time to think. Time to wonder if extraction meant leaving Atlanta or leaving the country or both. At 2:33 a.m., the breathing changed. Laura was in the supply closet, the regular one on the 4th floor, the one her downgraded access codes allowed, when she heard it. The sound carried through the open door and down the hallway, that particular quality of asymmetric respiration that every combat medic learns to hear in their sleep. One side of the chest expanding normally. The other side not. Shallow. Struggling. She'd heard it in Baghdad, in a kid with shrapnel embedded in his pleural cavity, in a Marine sergeant who'd taken a round through his right lung. Tension pneumothorax. The collapsed lung compressing the heart, suffocating from the inside out, the kind of thing that kills in minutes if you don't recognize it. The kind of thing that kills faster if you hesitate. Laura moved toward room for 12 at a walk, not a run. Running drew attention. Running triggered protocols. Walking with purpose looked like routine, like a night shift nurse responding to a patient, which was technically true, though the true part was buried under layers of cover story and false credentials that would dissolve the moment anyone pulled her file hard enough to read the annotations. The fluorescent light above room for 12 flickered as she entered, the bulb was dying, casting everything in a strobing white that made Cole's face look skeletal, aged 10 years from the young Special Forces medic she'd deployed within Helmand Province. "Can't breathe," he said. His voice sounded like gravel in a tumbler. "Right side. Pressure." She was already moving, her hands already steady because steadiness was like muscle memory and muscle memory didn't care about cover stories or extraction windows or the fact that Pierce was going to see her supply room access violation light up on his monitoring system in approximately 4 minutes. Pain is information. The body tells you what it needs if you listen. Cole's body was screaming tension pneumothorax, and her hands knew exactly what to do because they'd done it before in places where there were no regulations to violate, just the simple mathematics of life and death. The emergency override code was still in her handler's first encrypted message, buried in the second paragraph disguised as a patient history note. 7 digits that bypassed the automatic access denial and opened the restricted supply vault where the 14-gauge angiocath needles lived, the ones marked for emergency decompression only. Laura's fingers found the code without conscious thought, typing it into the keypad outside the supply room with the kind of precision that came from 17 years of training and 3 tours of duty and the specific brand of calm that you only developed after you'd already survived the worst thing that could happen. The door clicked open. She had the needle in her hand, 2¼ inches of steel and plastic, still in its sterile packaging, before the full weight of what she was doing landed on her. Not the medical part. That part was simple. Textbook, something she'd taught to junior medics in forward operating base Shank and demonstrated in combat scenarios across 3 provinces. The violation part. The access part. The insurance that Dr. Pierce would see the timestamp, the override code, the direct route from restricted supply to emergency procedure, all of it documented and time-stamped and impossible to explain without revealing either her incompetence or her hidden training, neither of which would survive scrutiny. Back in room for 12, Cole's breathing had deteriorated to short, tight gasps. O2 sat dropping. She could hear the monitor registering the decline, 91%, 90%, 88%, the numbers falling like a countdown with a ticking clock nobody could stop. The heart rate climbing to compensate, beating faster because the lungs couldn't get oxygen and the blood couldn't get oxygenated and everything was starting to fail in sequence. Laura had maybe 2 minutes before this became a code, before the resident froze, before the whole apparatus of hospital protocol ground into motion with the precision of a machine with nobody home operating it. She didn't ask permission. She didn't call for the resident. She simply prepped the skin, alcohol swab in her left hand, muscle memory guiding the motion, located the second intercostal space where the needle needed to go, where there was nothing but pleural cavity and collapsed lung, where the needle would find the air pocket and release the pressure that was killing him. "This will hurt," she said. One hand steadying Cole's ribs, the other angling the needle precisely, the angle and depth and insertion force all controlled by 17 years of muscle memory that lived in her hands and her shoulders and her brain stem. "Do it," Cole said. The needle went in. For a microsecond there was resistance, then the give of penetration, then the hiss. That unmistakable sound of air escaping from pleural space, the pressurized collapse releasing like someone opening a valve. Laura had heard that sound in Baghdad, heard it in training scenarios, heard it in her sleep sometimes when the dreams were bad. The hiss of survival. The hiss of pressure dropping. The hiss that meant the heart could beat normally again, the lungs could expand again, the body could remember how to live. She kept the needle steady, counted to 4, withdrew it leaving the plastic catheter in place to act as a one-way valve, allowing air to escape but not re-enter. Textbook emergency decompression. Textbook perfect. The kind of procedure that saved lives in combat zones and killed nurses' careers in American hospitals when they performed them without authorization and without a doctor present and without any legitimate license to be operating on anything except bedpans and vitals and the careful invisible work that hospitals expected nurses to do while erasing their competence. The monitor's numbers shifted almost immediately. O2 sat 92. 94. 96. The heart rate dropping from tachycardic panic back toward the range that meant the body had enough oxygen again, that the crisis was passing, that Staff Sergeant Marcus Cole would see sunrise. "Pressure's better," Cole gasped. "Breathing's better." "What did you?" "Needle decompression." "You had a tension pneumothorax," Laura said. Her voice sounded like it came from very far away, clinical and detached, the voice of someone describing weather to a stranger. "The right lung collapsed. I released the pressure. The resident should be here in 90 seconds. He'll probably put in a chest tube as a permanent fix. You're going to be fine." She was already moving toward the door, already calculating the timeline. 17 minutes until shift change. 12 minutes until the morning charge nurse arrived. 23 minutes until Dr. Pierce got the access report showing her override code, showing the supply room penetration, showing the violation written in precise timestamp and digital signature. What happened next was going to rewrite everything she'd built over 8 months, every relationship carefully constructed with nurses who treated her like just another tired woman pushing 70-hour weeks, every inch of trust banked against the eventual moment when someone figured out that Laura Bennett wasn't entirely who she claimed to be. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she'd done it anyway. 20 minutes after the needle went in and Cole's oxygen began climbing, Dr. Pierce appeared in the corridor outside room 412 with 2 security officers trailing like remoras behind a shark. His face was arranged in that particular expression of clinical concern he reserved for moments when his authority had been challenged, not angry yet, just the cold precision of a man tallying infractions. He'd reviewed her keycard access logs, the timestamp glowing accusingly in whatever system he monitored with the obsession of someone protecting territory. She'd entered the supply room at 2:24 a.m. without authorization. The charts would confirm it. The override protocols she'd used left digital fingerprints all across the hospital's restricted networks, and Dr. Pierce had been waiting for her to slip, waiting with the patience of a man who understood that the best sabotage looked like policy enforcement. "Miss Bennett," he said, his voice carrying that particular weight of formality that transformed a conversation into a verdict. Laura was washing her hands at the sink outside 412, the last of Cole's blood already swirling pink down the drain. She didn't turn immediately. She finished the soap, counted to 5 while the water ran warm, dried her hands with methodical precision on a paper towel. Only then did she face him. "Walk with me," Pierce continued, and it wasn't a request. It was a command delivered in the tone of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. The hallway at 3 in the morning had that particular silence of hospitals during the deep night shift, fluorescent lights casting everything in institutional white, the distant beep of monitors marking time like a metronome counting down toward something inevitable. Her colleagues had retreated to the break room or their stations. No one watched. No one intervened. Maria, the charge nurse who'd finally smiled at her last week, suddenly found urgent business in the medication dispensary. "You performed an unauthorized medical procedure," Pierce said, his words clipping the air like scissors through silk. "You accessed restricted supplies without proper authorization. You operated beyond your scope of licensure." Each charge was delivered as a separate sentence, surgical in its precision. He held a printed incident report. She could see her name typed across the header, could see the boxes already checked for violation categories. He'd prepared this before Cole's breathing had stabilized. He'd been ready. That was the part that told her everything. He'd anticipated her choice and had already drafted her termination. "I saved his life," Laura said. Her voice came out level, a simple statement of fact. No defense. No plea. Just data. "That," Pierce said, stopping outside the nurses' station where 2 night shift nurses suddenly became very interested in their computers, "is precisely what concerns me. A nurse who doesn't understand the difference between medical care and reckless endangerment shouldn't be working at a facility like St. Michael's." He turned to face her directly, and his eyes held something that looked almost like satisfaction. He'd been waiting for this. 8 months of calculated humiliation, and it had finally borne fruit. "You're suspended effective immediately pending a formal termination hearing scheduled for next Thursday. Security will escort you to collect your personal items from your locker. You will not access any patient areas. You will not speak to staff. You will surrender your badge and access codes." The security officers moved closer, bracketing her without making physical contact. It was the physical arrangement of her removal, not quite force, but the implicit promise that force could be applied. Laura looked at the officers, then back at Pierce. His jaw was tight. He wanted her to argue. He wanted resistance he could document, additional charges he could stack onto the report like blocks building a case he could defend in any hearing. She nodded once. "Very well," Pierce said, and there was that edge of disappointment in his voice, the frustration of a man who'd constructed an elaborate trap and watched his prey walk through it without struggling. "Let's collect your belongings." The locker room was in the basement, past the laundry processing area where the industrial washers thundered through their cycles even at this hour. The security officers stood by the door while Pierce watched her remove her things, a photo of Sophie in her dress uniform for the school play, her personal stethoscope with the weight of 1,000 uses worn into its earpieces, a half-empty bottle of ibuprofen, her extra scrubs, the jacket hanging on the hook with its careful stitching, the faded unit patch sewn into the lining still holding its secrets. She placed everything into a cardboard box. It took less than 3 minutes to pack away 8 months. The drive home was made in silence. Her hands on the steering wheel were perfectly steady, the kind of steady that comes from muscle memory, from 1,000 night drives through Baghdad after 12-hour shifts, from 18 years of training that taught her body to remain controlled while her mind made calculations about what came next. The streets of Atlanta were empty, just traffic lights cycling through their patterns and streetlights casting pools of sodium vapor orange on asphalt still warm from the day's heat. She parked the car in the driveway at 10:15 p.m. and sat for exactly 90 seconds before opening the door. Sophie was awake in the kitchen, still in her pajamas with the small cartoon bears printed on the fabric, her hair tangled from sleep and confusion. She'd waited up. 8 months of establishing normalcy, regular shifts, predictable schedules, the structure of a single mother and her daughter building a quiet life in Atlanta, and Sophie had learned to trust the rhythm. When the rhythm broke, she waited. "Mommy." Sophie's voice was small, uncertain. "Why aren't you at work?" Laura sat down at the kitchen table and put her head in her hands. The composure that had held through Pierce's dismissal, that had remained intact during the walk to her car, that had kept her hand steady through a 15-minute drive across the city finally, inevitably, fractured. The tears came freely, 8 months of careful construction dissolving in 60 seconds. The apartment lease under her cover name. Sophie's enrollment at Westside Elementary, her teacher conference noting that Sophie was quiet but observant, that she seemed to be listening to conversations adults thought she couldn't hear. The colleagues she'd cultivated, the intelligence she'd gathered on the visitors to 6 North, the pattern analysis she'd begun documenting, the mission parameters that had finally stopped making sense the moment Marcus Cole was admitted with fragmented ribs and a chest full of damaged tissue that looked exactly like the IED wounds she'd treated in Sanjin Valley, July 2019. When Captain Laura Bennett was someone else entirely and saving lives didn't cost her anything but bandages and blood. Sophie climbed into her lap with the directness of a child who understood only that her mother was broken and that her job was to fit into the broken spaces. "Are you in trouble?" she asked, her small hand patting Laura's shoulder in an imitation of comfort she'd learned from watching her mother work. Laura wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, managed a smile that felt like pulling a trigger. "No, baby. I just did my job. I did my job really well." 3 days later, Laura pushed through the St. Michael's entrance at 8 in the morning under an Atlanta sky the color of wet concrete. Dr. Pierce waited in the hallway outside the staff locker room, arms crossed, his presence taking up more space than his body occupied. He insisted on supervising her belongings' retrieval personally. Not a suggestion. A command delivered through clenched teeth. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in clinical white, stripping away any comfort. Laura's footsteps echoed on the tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. She moved like someone walking through a familiar battle space, each step deliberate, each breath controlled. Pierce followed close enough that she could hear his breathing, shallow, agitated, the sound of a man whose world had begun to crack. She opened her locker. The faded unit patch was still there, sewn into the lining of her jacket where no one had thought to look. That small piece of cloth held 8 months of careful isolation, of walking toward people who wouldn't walk toward her, of saving a life that should have cost her everything. Pierce watched her gather the few personal items she'd allowed herself, a photograph of Sophie, a coffee mug from the hospital orientation, 3 pens. Nothing that revealed anything. Just like Baghdad. Just like always. "You're done here," Pierce said. His voice carried the false authority of someone running on momentum, not foundation. "Your license will be flagged. I've already begun the credentialing review with the state board." Laura zipped the locker door closed. She didn't respond. Not yet. The composure that had held her together through 8 months of his escalating cruelty was still intact, still operating like a well-maintained weapon system. She turned toward the exit. That's when they heard it from the ICU wing, a patient bell, urgent and sustained, followed by the rapid footsteps of a nurse rushing toward Marcus Cole's room. By the time they reached room 407, the charge nurse was already there, Cole's eyes tracking toward the door with the focused intensity of someone who'd spent years learning to read every entrance point. When he saw Laura, something shifted across his face. Recognition. Not the polite acknowledgement of a patient recognizing a nurse. Something older. Something from another life, another time, another desert where they'd both been different people wearing different uniforms. Valkyrie, Cole whispered. His voice was rough from intubation, but the word came out like a code being transmitted through secure channels. Like a call sign being activated after months of dormancy. The hospital board president stood in the corner. The charge nurse froze mid-documentation. Dr. Pierce's hand found the door frame. Cole's breathing quickened, and the monitor reflected the spike. His eye stayed locked on Laura's, and his voice strengthened with each word, pulling oxygen from somewhere deeper than his damaged ribs. Captain Laura Bennett. Call sign Valkyrie. Silver Star recipient. He paused, drawing another breath. Someone get my commander. The next voice that entered the room arrived before its owner did. A Marine colonel in dress uniform stepped through the doorway with the kind of presence that made the air pressure change. Behind him stood a second officer, a two-star general with ribbons aligned with mathematical precision across his chest. The colonel approached Cole's bedside and opened a leather folder. Staff Sergeant Marcus Cole, the colonel began, his voice cutting through the room like steel through silk. You've requested verification of this patient's military service record. He glanced at Laura, then back to the paper. Captain Laura Bennett. 3 tours in Baghdad, 2008 through 2011. 75th Ranger Regiment attached to JSOC Task Force 121. The colonel's eyes tracked along the page. Carried 2 wounded soldiers, Specialists Chen and Rodriguez, through active fire engagement for approximately 3 kilometers in 115-degree ambient temperature. Both soldiers survived due to her direct intervention and medical competency under fire. Dr. Pierce's face had begun draining of color, but it was what came next that stopped his heart completely. The two-star general stepped forward and rendered a salute so sharp it could draw blood. His hand struck his temple with precision, held for 2 full seconds, then released. It was the kind of salute reserved for ceremonies and moments of profound respect. Captain Bennett. The Pentagon has been searching for Valkyrie for the last 3 days. Your handler reported you went dark at 2,100 hours on shift change. Your intelligence operation at St. Michael's is now active on Pentagon desk. He paused, and his eyes found Pierce. And we're very interested in the details of your suspension paperwork. Pierce moved. Not toward Laura. Toward the exit. He lunged for the door with the desperation of someone who'd suddenly understood that every strategic move he'd made, every careful manipulation, every calculated character assassination, had been logged and documented by federal investigators who'd been watching his electronic signature the entire time. He didn't make it. 2 FBI agents in dark jackets stood in the hallway outside Cole's room, and Pierce ran directly into them like a man colliding with gravity. One agent, a mid-50s, with the bearing of someone who'd spent 2 decades reading people's faces, stepped aside and gestured toward the cardiac care conference room. Not an invitation. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Dr. Richard Pierce. We need to talk about your billing irregularities and some interesting modifications to patient charts over the last 72 hours. They walked him down the corridor, and Laura watched his shoulders begin to collapse inward like a structure losing its load-bearing walls. Through the glass wall of the conference room, she could see him gesturing frantically as the agents laid out documents on the table. Forged patient charts. Altered billing codes with her electronic signature, her name on documents she'd never touched, using her credentials to fabricate evidence of incompetence she'd never committed. The FBI agent's voice was audible even from where Laura stood. Every alteration Pierce made was logged with a timestamp. Every single one traces back to his administrator login. Your attempt to erase records of your own crimes is now a separate federal charge. Pierce's face cycled through colors, red to gray to white to something beyond color entirely. Laura's handler had flagged his financial records to the Bureau 3 weeks ago. While Laura monitored the foreign asset on the 6th floor, while she documented the billing irregularities that weren't her real mission, while she performed needle decompression on Marcus Cole with hands that knew how to work in extremis, the FBI had been building a parallel investigation. They'd watched him restrict her access codes. They'd recorded his calls to the medical supply company detailing kickback percentages. They'd been monitoring the hospital's medical database when Pierce, panicked and sloppy in his desperation, used her electronic signature on documents dated back weeks, claiming she'd committed errors she'd never made. He'd created a perfect trail that led directly back to him. Laura's phone vibrated in her pocket. Her military handler, calling from the Pentagon. She stepped into the hallway, phone to her ear, and the general's voice came through crisp and clear, "Captain Bennett. Federal prosecution is moving forward on Pierce's charges. Your intelligence operation on the foreign asset succeeded despite your covert termination. Subject was apprehended 72 hours ago with sufficient documentation from your 8-month surveillance." A pause. "Your next assignment is voluntary. Stand by for reassignment or transition to civilian status. Your choice this time." She closed her eyes for just a moment. Long enough to feel the weight of the patch in her jacket lining, the faded fabric that held the memory of everything she'd been before this hospital, before this cover, before she'd walked toward a patient in distress instead of walking away. Long enough to hear the silence, the kind of deep, genuine silence that comes from respect, not fear. "Understood, sir," she said quietly. 6 months later, the Pentagon ceremony unfolded in dress blues and dress uniforms, every decoration aligned with geometric precision. Laura stood in formation with 13 other military personnel, a uniform creased sharp enough to cut glass. The Secretary of Defense moved down the line, stopping at her position. The small box contained a commendation medal for her intelligence work, for 8 months of careful documentation, for the courage it had taken to maintain cover in a hostile environment. For saving a life when it cost her everything. Sophie sat in the front row, finally old enough to understand why her mother had come home crying that night. Not because she'd failed, but because she'd succeeded at the cost of her mission. Not because she'd lost, but because she'd won by choosing what mattered more. Cole stood beside Laura, chest heeled, back in active duty as a training instructor, and shook her hand with the grip of someone who'd been saved twice and would spend the rest of his life remembering. Somewhere in Atlanta, in a fluorescent-lit community college classroom in a strip mall next to a laundromat, Dr. Richard Pierce taught CPR fundamentals to board students for $15 an hour. His medical license was gone. His career was gone. He demonstrated chest compressions on a plastic dummy while his hands, the hands that had manipulated and fabricated and destroyed, performed repetitive motions on synthetic flesh, teaching a skill he'd once mastered but would never practice again. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. Laura Bennett had been quiet for 8 months at St. Michael's. Quiet while a man tried to break her. Quiet while she saved lives. Quiet while she documented corruption. Quiet while her cover was burning. And in that quiet had been everything: training, composure, honor, and the kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. That's the power of restraint. That's what happens when someone decides that saving a life matters more than saving a mission. That's what happens when the Pentagon comes looking and finds not a broken nurse, but a captain. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, subscribe and let us know in the comments. What would you have done in Laura's position? Like this video, hit the notification bell, and join us next week for another story about the ones nobody expected.